All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in today. So last week, or earlier this week, excuse me, we talked about sort of reintroduction to the channel, reintroduction to the content, what we're going to be talking about over the course of these videos and the course of these series. So I wanted to talk about today, again, keeping it pretty brief. I think that'll be kind of a common theme among these videos, is we'll just keep it short and sweet and to the point, is how I personally, as a coach, train tactical operators. There's a number of different ways to do it. Just like when you're training athletes, sporting athletes, there's a number of different ways to train athletes. There's a number of different ways to train tactical operators as well. So the way that I train athletes is that the way that I train operators is that I use the conjugate method. Okay, and I've spoken about this in my books, in some of my posts, but I use the conjugate method when training tactical operators. So I run a traditional 4-day split, a traditional sort of like West Side split, even though we're not training at West Side, so obviously it's not quote West Side, but a traditional conjugate split as laid out by Louis. So typically we have 5 training days in a week. Some days it's truncated down to 3 or 4, just depends on what's going on. If we have holidays, if we have danzas, if we have training holidays, if whatever's going on, right? The military is a very fluid machine, and oftentimes there are situations in which we have short weeks, we have days off, we have training holidays, that kind of stuff. So typically, the way I like to do things is day 1, which is usually Monday, will be our max effort lower. The way that I like to do things is I rotate squat and deadlift from week to week. So within a 3-week training wave, which is how I like to program, we'll have 2 squat days and 1 deadlift day. Right, but that's just for max effort. We still do a dynamic effort lower, which I'll touch on in a moment. But for our max effort lower, we have 2 squat days and 1 deadlift day. Now, if you're looking at things from a powerlifting perspective, it makes sense to throw in like a max effort good morning, usually typically for like a 3-rep max as compared to a 1-rep max. Personally, I have found that the return on investment for a max effort good morning with a tactical population, a population that already has lower back issues, shoulder issues, hip and knee issues, is not that high, right? The risk to reward ratio is very lopsided in favor of risk. So it just makes sense to not expose them to that kind of trauma or that kind of stimulus, because you don't really know what's going to happen. They may see the stimulus, they may see the benefit of the movement, they may also get hurt, right? And the main goal and the main emphasis of being a tactical strength and conditioning coach, or strength and conditioning coach in general, is to make sure that your athletes or your operators are improving and not getting hurt, right? We don't want anybody to get hurt ever. Accidents do happen from time to time, but we want them to be accidents. We want them to be few and far between, and we don't want them to be because of programmatic issues, right? So again, I do not program max effort good mornings. We will still do good mornings, but as like a secondary or an accessory exercise. But I have found that for the tactical population, again with the issues that I listed earlier, that max effort good mornings are simply not the way to go. So again, 2 squat days, 1 deadlift day. We pull primarily sumo. I've found that sumo tends to be a little bit easier on the lower back, on the spinal erectors, obviously because of the leverages and the position that you're in. Also building up the hips, the hamstrings, the glutes, and the adductors as compared to a conventional deadlift. Now, that's not to say that we never conventional deadlift, and very much of what I'm going to talk about here is not set in stone. These are just sort of the standards by which I abide, by which I operate. When we squat, 99.9% of the time we will squat to a box. I've found that the box squat is a much more effective teaching tool for those who maybe don't have as much experience under the bar. It's easy to learn, it's easy to teach, and it's easy to execute. Typically we'll squat in a wide stance, so sumo stance, again, for the same reasons that I talked about with the deadlift. It builds the hips, it builds the hamstrings, the glutes, posterior chain as a whole. And with a population that typically experiences knee issues, we want to make sure that we're staying out of the knee as much as possible. Now, that's not to say that we won't ever attack the quads, or we won't ever address, like connective tissue issues through the knee. But in my opinion, if we're loading something up to max effort to a top single, loading a problematic body area or problematic joint region is probably not the smartest idea, right? So we'll have our max effort movement, we'll have a secondary movement, and then we'll have typically 4 to 5 excuse me, 4 to 5 accessory movements, followed by some ESD or energy system development. So that's day 1. Day 2 is typically again, on a 5-day training split. Day 2 is our dynamic effort upper. So this can be two different things. It can either be a true dynamic effort day, where we bench against either bands or chains for lower volume but higher higher speed, higher intensity. Well, I'm not higher intensity. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Higher velocity, right? Low intensity, lower volume per set, higher velocity, right? That's the whole point of speed work, is your rate of force development, how fast you can produce force, not how much force you can actually produce, but how fast you can produce it. So we'll either go a true speed day, or we'll go a volume day. It just depends on where we are in the phase. It depends on what I think the operators need. And so by a volume day, I mean we still operate at a relatively low intensity, but it's basically a linear periodization across multiple weeks of like a 6x6, and then to an 8x8 and a 10x10. And that's something I also got from Louis, whether it was in one of his books or in a video. That's something I picked up from Louis Simmons as well. So typically Tuesdays are higher volume days, at least for our accessory stuff. Weight is a little bit lower, but higher volume stuff, usually a lot of band work, pull aparts, triceps, face pulls, that kind of stuff. Just really pump some volume into the system, get some blood flowing, and work on some connective tissue hypertrophy. Because one thing that these guys, again, typically experience is a lot of joint issues, right? Whether they're jumping out of planes or helicopters and they're landing wrong, or they're rucking, with an excessive amount of weight over an excessive amount of distance. Their knees and their elbows and their hips and their ankles and their wrists, they all take a beating. So if we can help strengthen that connective tissue via higher volume, low intensity work, then I'm all in favor of it. So that's day 2. Day 3 is typically like I hate to call it a Metcon, but like a GPP type day, some sort of complex. Whether it's kettlebell, barbell, I love trap bar complexes. I think they're an underutilized tool. I think the trap bar has a lot of versatility. You just have to be creative enough to know how to use it. Typically very short, 15 to 20 minutes worth of work, but high intensity, high effort, and then we're done for the day. Sometimes followed by some additional ESD, but typically we're getting enough GPP stimulus through our complex that we don't need to address additional ESD through cardio. Day 4 is our dynamic effort lower. So this is typically a traditional West Side speed day as well. We will squat to a box versus either bands or chains, and then we'll pull from the floor against either bands or chains. Typically, again, higher total volume, lower per set volume, so lower volume within the context of each set, meaning only like 1 to 2 repetitions, but higher volume across multiple sets. We run these in 3-week waves, 50, 55, and 60%. Now, when you start looking at like powerlifting, you can start talking about, okay, do I need to prescribe a certain percentage to my accommodating resistance? Like, do I need to have a certain band? Do I need to have a certain amount of chain? I think there's value to that. But I think, again, with a typically under-trained population, at least as far as like strength training goes, you can get away with keeping things very simple. Like, hey, you know what, today we're going to go 50% versus a single chain. Next week, 55 versus a chain. Week 3, 60% versus a chain. So we don't have to worry about like 50% bar weight plus 25% accommodating resistance. And then the same can go for bands. The way that I typically like to prescribe things is via a threshold. So let's say if you squat above 315, you can use light bands on your dynamic effort squat. If you squat below 315, you're going to use monster minis, right? And again, it's not a foolproof system, but it's an easy catch-all and it's an easy threshold to delineate or distinguish between two groups or two sort of echelons of performance, right? Again, we pull from the floor. I'm not a huge block or rack pull guy, especially for dynamic effort work. We'll pull against either bands or chains. For our band work, or for our bands, we use doubled minis pretty much exclusively. And then chain weight, we just use the same amount of chain that we would use if we're squatting. So if we're squatting against 80 pounds of chain, so 2 chains per side, 4 chains total, we're gonna use that same amount of chain weight on the deadlift. Now again, is that the most precise method? Absolutely not. But as any coach knows, sometimes precision is not always feasible, right? At least like tight precision, high precision is not always feasible. Sometimes you just have to do the best you can with what you have and make it work. And then again, higher volume posterior chain work after our main squat and deadlift. And then day 5 is our heavy bench day, our max effort upper. So we'll rotate between bench press and floor press variations. I stay away from overhead variations just because I think that most people aren't strong enough overhead to handle max effort. And then that begs the question, like, well, do we get them stronger? But then that begs the question of why? Why are we doing something to get them stronger in a range of motion? Is it for just the sake of being stronger in that position, or is it serving a particular purpose within the context of their tactical operations, right? But we'll bench press, we'll floor press. I love accommodating resistance. I love board pressing, especially for people with shoulder issues. We don't really do too much like reverse band stuff. Every once in a while I'll throw it in. It's just like an overload. Like if we have a big holiday coming up, like a 4-day holiday, I want some like massive stimulus so they can recover over that holiday. Sometimes I'll throw that in, but typically we just stay straight weight or accommodating resistance. I love close grip work as long as the shoulders can handle it. And then just like on our max effort lower day, we'll have our primary movement followed by a secondary movement, followed by 4 to 6 accessory movements, followed by some ESD. So that's how I train tactical operators. It's very simple, right? Like I mentioned in my last video, the X's and O's of this are pretty simple. It just comes down to understanding your population, understanding what you think they need. This necessitates asking the population, hey, you as the operator, what do you need? But then you can't make every single operator happy, right? You can either take like an average and say like, okay, so many people responded with this, so many people responded with that, and so many people responded with this, and take like your top 3 traits or characteristics or qualities and plug those into your programming, or you can just do the best that you can. And that's typically where you're going to fall, is just doing the best that you can with what you know about the population. And it comes down to understanding the population, getting to know them as humans and as operators, right? So both personal and professional relationships are very important in this business. And I can talk about that in a later video. But yeah, the X's and O's of this are pretty simple. Most of the guys we work with keep themselves fit already. I'd say 90% of the guys keep themselves in good condition because they have to. They have to take ACFT tests, fitness tests. They have to be able to run and ruck a certain distance under a certain time. They have to be able to execute so many push-ups and pull-ups and that kind of stuff, right? So there are standards by which they are, or to which they are held and by which they are measured. And most of these guys are sort of self-motivated anyway, so they want to stay in shape, whether it's for themselves or for their kids or their families or for their team, whatever it may be. They want to keep themselves healthy and in shape as best as possible, and we're just here to help facilitate that process. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Like, subscribe, comment, and as always, don't waste the pain.